Welcome to the Pat Mayo Experience, continuing our coverage of the 2018 fantasy baseball season. If you just check the description, whether you're watching the video or listening to the podcast, by one click, you can find the entire draft package on the bottom of the description, or even the top of the description. Depends on where I put it in. But joining me on the line to talk about snake draft strategy, Joe Pisapia, the author of the Fantasy Black Book. Joe, tell everyone about this year's Fantasy Black Book.
Well, it's very black, and it's full of fantasy stuff.
So hold on 1 second. Is it like the Spinal Tap thing where it's like, how much more black could this be? In the answer,
it's very black. It's quite black. Don't even look. Sometimes I tell people, don't even open it. Just buy it. Don't even open it. Sometimes it's just not worthy of looking at. It's all. But yeah, it's a labor of love, Pat. Like most things in life that are worth doing. This is the 11th Black Book, and they've all gone to #1 in baseball and football on Amazon, and this year I think it's the best one yet. And I'm not just saying that, I really mean it, because Paul Sporer did the pitching profiles, Jake Seeley worked on it with me, and Sammy Reed did all of the DFS chapter, which is absolutely spectacular. Sammy does a great job, and I did all the infielders plus all the relative position value. And the Black Book is about something very different. In a world where we are all handed so many stats and every host site gives you so much information, what do you have that really separates you from the pack? Well, you have relative position value, which teaches you not only about player value, but also how valuable players are in certain formats. And we really break down players in terms of lefty-righty splits, home road splits, first, second half splits, all the information. So you know if this guy's a DFS player, if this guy is more of a player you should use in season-long roto, and to understand that player value and to quantify position scarcity. And not just as a draft guide, but we've got a chapter in there about being the commissioner and the pitfalls of that, about how to make trades and trade etiquette. It goes a lot deeper. It's a season-long companion. It's the best friend that you really need to have if you're a giant fantasy nerd.
Well, listen, you sold me on you sold me on Sporer, you sold me on Sammy, and then you said Seeley, and I was like, I don't know about that.
I tried to slip it in. There in the middle. I thought you wouldn't notice, but yeah.
Eventually, I'll have to have him on to talk about his rankings, although we might just stick to football. Some people have to stick to sports, some people stick to politics. With Jake and I, maybe we'll just stick to football. Who knows? But today, we were talking again about snake draft strategy. We did a complete auction strategy that is already released. You can go check that out if your format is an auction. I kind of want to boil this down. What do you think the most common league is for a snake draft? 12-person, 5x5?
Yeah, I would even say, somewhere between 10 and 12 teams too. I think the 10-team league is something people don't realize exists a lot more. And people say, well, how do you approach a league that's shallow? I'd love to play in a 10-team league. I think the smallest one I play in is 15. But, how you approach that is really to make sure, and using RPV, relative position value, having a Gary Sanchez, even though there's only 10 catchers out there, it makes a difference. Understanding that, the elite players are still very much elite, and also understanding how to build from the inside out, the more shallow those rosters are. And what I mean from the inside out is, paying attention to those guys like the Lindors and the Ramirez's, building that strong infield. And if you're only playing 3 outfielders or even 5 outfielders in a 10-team or even 12-team league sometimes at the most, depending on how deep the pools are, you're better off going from the inside and building from the infield, and then going to the outfield and those other positions later on.
So I think you mentioned a very interesting name to start this off, and that's Gary Sanchez. Let's say you don't play in a 2-catcher league. Let's say you play in a 1-catcher league. And when you go to like ESPN and look at the average draft positions, it's going to be for a 1-catcher league. But if you use NFBC and some of the pro-style ADPs that are out there, like a lot of the ones provided by Stats Inc., those are for 2-catcher leagues. So if the ADP on Gary Sanchez is around 25 for 2-catcher leagues, that makes sense. He's projected to be the best catcher. You have 2 of these slots to fill up, and it's hard to find catchers. If you play in a 12-team league with only 1 catcher, should you still be reaching on someone like Gary Sanchez that high, or is the discrepancy between 1 and 12 not as big as it is between 1 and 24 when you look at it?
Now I can give you relative position value. Well, Gary Sanchez is the only guy worth paying for, because he's the only guy that can really have those 30 home run type seasons at catcher right now. He's the only guy. And the significant drop off, which again, I quantify in understanding what the fantasy league average catcher is. If you're in a, let's say a 12-team league that only plays 1 catcher, or a 12-team league that plays 2 catchers. Either way, Sanchez is the only guy. But here's the thing. If you're in a 2-catcher league, and I hate the 2-catcher league, it's just done. It's over. It should never be a thing. Hashtag kill the two catcher league. It's in my book. To me, when I look at these guys right now, even if you draft Gary Sanchez, eventually you're going to draft some other catcher who's going to weigh him down. So you're better off just looking for values later on and trying to do it that way and not spend that much on catcher if you're in an auction or in a snake for that matter. If you're in a single catcher league, though, Gary Sanchez does become a little bit more useful because it is going to be a little bit harder to separate yourself because it's not going to be marginalization by a second catcher dragging down all the good work. I know in previous shows we talked about, mediocre starters dragging down the good work if you don't back up a Kershaw type ace. Same thing is true at catcher. If you don't back up that catcher right away, it ends up going for naught. And the problem is catcher's such a volatile position with injuries and playing time that it can really bother you. And I'll tell you a little quiz for you here, Pat Mayo. How many catchers had 400 at-bats last year?
If it's a question for me, and I don't know, I'll say 0.
Well, it wasn't quite that bad, but just 9. And if you go back 2 years ago, that number was double. And this is why I say it's time to get rid of the two catcher league, because we've gone to a place where it's not really an offensive position. And if you're an offensively talented player, they want you somewhere in that lineup every day. They want you DH, they want you at first base, they want you in the outfield. They want to get you and they groom you to get away from home plate because you're going to be worth more to the organization with that bat than you will with that glove. And it's just a fact right now. Unless you're an incredibly defensive catcher, it's very difficult if you have a great bat too to stick at that position. So the two catcher formats, I beg everybody out there, if you're still playing them, just stop. All you're doing is just marginalizing the whole thing. And, you're going to make me want to take some sort of platoon situation for, later on of Suzuki and Tyler Flowers and just play in the daily transaction league, whoever's starting that day. And I'll do that to you, but don't make me do that to you because then nobody's happy.
So we can get rid of the two catchers like the movement that has been somewhat successful in getting rid of kickers in football.
It's very similar. It's absolutely a good look. They don't play every day. Their injury risk is much higher. Their fatigue factor is much higher. At this point in time, I just don't understand. And when you're talking about just the sheer volume not being there, 9 guys, just 9 players who qualify a catcher had 400 at-bats last year. And it's just a joke. I mean, the worst thing you can do is overpay for a guy like Buster Posey because there's a guy who's a nice player, he's a nice hitter. Yeah, he's good for a catcher. But just because he's good for a catcher doesn't mean he's really good altogether. And the actual value you're getting there with him, considering the risk, it's not a game-changing kind of value. Sanchez is, everybody else at catcher is not.
Okay, so in almost every single site that you look at, Mike Trout is going number 1 in the snake draft, and Jose Altuve is going number 2. Number 3 seems to be up for discussion. Who do you have as your number 3 player that you'd take?
Well, again, with me, the answer will always be format. If it's some sort of points league, I'm always going pitching.
You're always going pitching in a points league? All right, that's probably good to know.
Oh, yeah. In a points, here's how you do. Look, in points leagues, here's how you win. All right, this is my bread and butter. I love points leagues. I hate sitting there waiting 5x5 roto. I play everything, but it doesn't mean I like it. I eat all the vegetables too, but I don't like them all. It's just part of what's going to keep me a healthy fantasy analyst, and that's why I play other formats. But with the situation you have here, when you have a player in terms of points leagues, if you front load that starting pitching and you have a true ace at number 1, and then somehow you're able to draft another top tier pitcher as your number 2, well, that means that as you continue on, when you draft, let's say, a number 2 pitcher as a number 3, and so on and so forth, you will be outproducing on a regular basis everyone else in your league. And when you add in the 2 start week factors to that of those elite top tier pitchers, you're going to be better on a weekly basis. And you're also going to avoid those negatives. See, people forget about that and they say, I can make up pitching later and play matchups, but you're going to be playing them with guys who somewhat of mediocre. And that's going to be dangerous. And you're avoiding those negatives are really important because bad pitching can take away all that good offensive work that your team does in points leagues. So if you're looking at fantasy and you boil it down, Pat, to the basics, it's about me outproducing you from as many spots as I possibly can. And if I could do that consistently in points leagues from the pitching standpoint, I can control that. And basically, it's going to put me in a position to be better suited to beat you on a weekly basis.
So at that number 3 pick in a points league, it would be Kershaw, or would it be someone else?
You know what? I love Kershaw, but back-to-back years I've owned him, and he's burned me here with his back injury, and it's concerning. It's concerning because it's happened twice where it would have been the playoffs for me, and it's I'll be frank, it pissed me off. So for me, I think Scherzer is probably the safer bet in terms of durability factor at this point. Still plays on a great team. So I think I'll flip-flop Scherzer for one right now. Plus the strikeout rate's pretty high with him too. Kershaw was a close two, but I'll go there. But to answer the question too about your regular old roto for the most part, whether it be season long or head-to-head categories, I think Arenado's the safer guy in terms of what you're getting because he's been so consistent year over year. You have that Colorado factor in there. I don't think the Humidor is going to all of a sudden just crush Paul Goldschmidt. I mean, Paul Goldschmidt has legit power no matter where he is. It doesn't matter if he's in Chase Field or somewhere else. When Paul Goldschmidt hits home run goes far. So if the Humidor costs him 2 or 3 home runs, whatever, you can still make a case for him too. But I think Arenado is probably the safer of the two guys heading into this year, even though he might not give you the steals you're looking for. I think in terms of the incredible RBI production, which is a lost art form, that's a guy that I would consider, plus the extraordinarily high batting average too, which in Colorado is going to help over a full season.
So if it's going to be Arenado there for you at number 3, it seems to be kind of up for grabs right now. You have Arenado going, Trey Turner going, Goldschmidt, Kershaw has been propped up into that spot. Bryce Harper, some people are taking it number 3 for maybe he has a gigantic season. Who knows? But when it comes to value-based drafting, how long do you wait on sort of, let's say Paul Goldschmidt, for example. First base seems to be super thin this year. At least that's what the internet tells me. Would that be a reason to bump him up a little bit or even potentially reach on a first baseman somewhere in the draft?
Well, what looks like a thin position every year ends up turning in the opposite. So I wouldn't worry too much about that because that seems to always be the trend in Major League Baseball. What you think is going to be X ends up being Y. I think that Bryce Harper going up that far is fine. I think even Charlie Blackmon's a guy people should not be sleeping on. I mean, Charlie Blackmon every year is getting that job done. He's almost like a Mike Trout light at this point, which is astounding. But he's a guy that I've gotten in snake drafts as late as 8th. And if you're in a deeper league with 5 active outfielders, I would push you to take a Harper or a Blackmon with one of those top 5 picks for sure, because outfield is going to fly off the board. If you think first base is bad, outfield is worse. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. Look, you can't really lose in these guys when you're talking about this top tier talent, but going for a top 5 overall pick with Trey Turner is a dangerous game. And here's why. He needs to become that player for 155 games that you think he is. And I say 155 because I'm assuming some kind of days off in there. But the guy's never played a full season. The guy's going to probably be hitting 2 in this order, not 1. So if you think he's going to be running as much as he did last year, hitting in front of Bryce Harper, I think you're sadly mistaken. And it's not to say he can't become the player that's worth a top 3 overall pick. But the problem is, if you take him there, he must become that guy. And if he must become that guy, then all of a sudden, if he doesn't, you've set your entire roster back because you passed on guys like Arenado, like Goldschmidt, even like his teammate Bryce Harper or Troy Blackmon that are very proven that they are that guy.
So you're far willing to take a higher floor player with substantial upside in the first 10 picks rather than kind of roll the dice on what could be on a player. What's the point of the draft where that switches for you and be like, hey, now I'm shooting for upside?
Well, for me, I like to have my upside as I get out of the first 5, 6 rounds. I'm looking for upside in the latter half of the draft because it doesn't cost me as much if I'm wrong. And I understand some people say, hey, you want to take gambles, but I think it's about taking calculated risks, not just taking risks for risk's sake, especially when you're talking about baseball, which is, a game that, the old adage most people play to the back of their baseball cards, right, Pat? So if you play the back of your baseball card and those numbers will be there eventually, and you've proven over a 5-6 year sample size that you are this player, like Jose Abreu, for instance, I am much more apt to take Jose Abreu before I take Rhys Hoskins. Hoskins had a phenomenal end of the season. He's only played about 50 games. And it's so dangerous to extrapolate those 50 games over a player that's had several 300 seasons, had several 30 home run or more seasons, had several 100 RBI seasons all in a row every single year. Give me the known entity of Jose Abreu before I take the upside of Rhys Hoskins, because the upside of Rhys Hoskins is, guess what? A full season of Jose Abreu that I already know I can have. So I think it's understanding that those are the type of risks that are unnecessary. So I don't like unnecessary risks early in drafts. I'll tell you what, in a situation I've seen lately, I don't like to take pitchers early on in Roto, but when Noah Syndergaard lasts well into the end of the 3rd round, and I've seen that sometimes, I will buck that trend in my own, rules that I put on myself, and I'll take Syndergaard because I know It wasn't an arm injury last year that sidelined him. It was mishandling that sidelined him, and one injury turning to another. And then on top of which, it's a situation where I know he can be a true number one, and I'm going to get him that late. Those are the kind of risks that are smart risks to take because you've already seen how good he can be.
So when it comes to pitching in a snake draft, 5x5, roto season long, unless the situation presents itself where there's a tremendous value on a pitcher, you're just piling up on hitting?
I'm piling up on hitting, and I'm doing that early and often. And it's for a couple of reasons. Number one, hitting tends to stay healthier more often through the whole season. And we've seen that just recently. Yeah, there's injuries in baseball and anything can happen, but typically hitting is a little bit more predictable and a little safer of an early investment. Then something I like to talk about a lot in the Black Book too is, if you have that true ace and you don't back it up right away, well, then you just marginalize all the good work that the ace has done. That elite level productivity ends up coming down to a lower level because you've taken a great true number one and you've stuck him next with, in the number two spot with a guy who's really maybe a low end number three type starter. And basically what do you get? Mediocrity. The other thing I like to do is mitigate that risk in my rotation by trying to do it with bodies. So I'm saying, like, if you can give me an Archer and a Carlos Martinez, if you can give me back-to-back 1As, maybe in the fourth, fifth round, I'm more apt to do that than I am to go for that true number one, because then at least if there's an injury, all is not lost. Plus, I'm also doubling up and I'm getting a little bit of an advantage where my number two is really a number one or a very high-end number two starter. And that way I'm able to really spread out those good statistics that they'll give me over a full season to the rest of that rotation.
So in terms of pitching, you would wait probably until the fourth, potentially fifth round, and then you say even double up with pitchers. Would you triple up on pitchers? If you took two pitchers in the fifth and sixth round, would you then not take another one until like the 12th round?
You know what? I don't like to lock myself into those kind of things. I think that kind of thinking, it gets people in trouble. Well, I won't do this or I won't do that. It's about being flexible in the draft coming to you. And I'll say this, I don't mind doubling up. I also don't mind just taking the one guy if that one guy is there that I like Syndergaard, I said earlier, who might fall further than he should. And if that happens, then I would wait till the fifth round to get my number two, because I've already pushed that number one to a place where I think they're a true number one. So really it has to do with the roster construction. And the other reason, too, that I hate to take pitching early on in roto formats is you're leaving those elite all-around guys for other teams to have. You're leaving the Francisco Lindors, you're leaving the Correas, you're leaving these players out there that have massive upside and massive contribution. And it's going to be hard to find those guys later on. They don't exist. They go early for a reason. So give me the offense, give me the safe investment, the better return on investment, and I'll figure out pitching later on, because we've all seen even the elite pitchers are not, impossible for them to get hurt.
When should I start thinking about closers? Do I need an elite closer? Do I wait till the end to pick up guys who may or may not have the job, pick four of them and hope to get lucky on two of them, and then make some waiver wire moves as new situations occur? Or do I really want to establish myself? Because it seems like it's a really large camp in how people feel. It's like, oh, you need to get your one guy, then you can fill it in later. Some people like to go grab three guys. And I know this switches between if it's NL only, AL only, but we're talking about mixed leagues here, a 12-team roto. What do you do with closers?
Well, the first thing I need to find out is, are there mandatory RP slots? Now, if there's mandatory RP slots that I have to fill, and let's say it's a 12-team or more, it's getting a little dicey. If you're in a 15-team league with two RP mandatory slots you have to fill on a weekly basis, closers and elite closers are worth a little bit more, because there's going to be guys out there on a weekly basis that aren't closers that are going to be started by teams. So in those style leagues, I'm more apt to be aggressive. As you see, normally those elite closers start going somewhere in the fifth or sixth round, somewhere in that range, sometimes seventh, depending on the league depth, but that's about normally where they are. I'm of the mind it's two ways. Either you're going to go for one of the top three guys, or you're going to wait and let the market come to you. I prefer to wait and let the market come to me because, again, I want to go for those offensive players. I want to solidify that offense, especially offense is a juggernaut right now. These rotations are terrible. The back ends of even good rotations are terrible. Offense will continue to be up in 2018. So what does that mean? That means I want to be at the forefront. I don't want to wait and hope that I can get that offense later. I want to be leading the pack. And if I start taking closers too early, or the worst thing, take a mediocre closer with a 7th round pick, that's the worst thing you can do. Go high, and get one of those elite guys or wait for the market. And I found, Pat, in so far drafts I've done, the market toward the end is going to lead guys like Brandon Morrow out there. It's going to leave Hector Neris out there, Vizcaino. It's going to leave a bunch of guys that you can live with that right now have the job, don't have any threat to that job, and all have decent strikeout abilities. So why would I pay for that middle tier grouping when I know that only bad things can come of that and I'm passing out on offense? So don't do that. Let the market come to you. There's plenty of buys later on, and there will be plenty of guys on the waiver wire every single year.
The perception that's out there right now in terms of drafting is that there's a lot of power, there's not that much speed, and it's inflating some of these speed guys. How do you go about approaching potential specialists in these categories, at least early on? Like D. Gordon, for example, well, he's not only going to help you out in speed, he will help you out in average, and he should score some runs in Seattle. Do you let him go by the wayside in like the mid-20s and wait for a specialist later on, or are you better off reaching for a speedster and then waiting on power later on?
I'm one of these guys that if you're in a head-to-head roto league situation, you can understand the D. Gordon, love. And I get that. And that's because D. Gordon by himself can win you a category that week. D. Gordon can win you steals all by himself on a good week. So if it's season-long roto, that's one where it's a difficult thing to find. There's lots of guys out there still. It's funny, Starling Marte is a guy that everybody was falling over themselves last year to get. He had the suspension for the drug problem issue with the performance-enhancing drugs, and he missed some time, and he was pretty good in the second half when he came back. But now all of a sudden he's a non-entity. Well, last time I checked, that guy can hit 15 home runs and steal 40 bases and hit 280. So when people are going for D. Gordon, I kind of look and I say, well, would I rather have Starling Marte a little bit later on? There's other ways to do it. And to me, I don't think you have to put all your eggs in that one basket. Now, if it's head-to-head roto categories, I get it, because the reason I don't like that format is it makes guys like Billy Hamilton, like Joey Gallo, who have one elite tool but are subpar baseball players in a lot of ways, it makes them worthy of our fantasy selection. I think that's a format that, that shouldn't be the case. We should value players like they are in real life. Fantasy should be a mirror of the real game to us, and roto head-to-head categories isn't, because Gerard Dyson in years has been useful. And Gerard Dyson is a fourth outfielder bench player type, but yet he's useful in that one format. So in season-long roto, I like players where I can get 15 steals out of them, 10 steals out of them, build it that way while I'm being responsible. So I don't give up batting average. I don't give up RBIs. I don't give up the house to rob Peter to pay Paul, because at the end, what do? I just become a mediocre team. Look for strength, build strength, because there's guys like Rugnet Odor, there's guys like Elvis Andrews, there's plenty of guys out there who can get you 15 to 20 steals out there and give you power and give you RBIs and other stats as well.
So you would really go with power at the beginning of the draft over speed if you couldn't find the 5-category guy?
Well, I think it's a combination. I think those 5-category guys are out there too. And I think like Altuve, we need to start understanding that they're coming in a new package, and that new package is the little guy. It's Jose Ramirez. It's Francisco Lindor, who, 2 years ago I said was going to hit for power, and everyone said I was crazy. And then last year when he did, I said, this guy's going to be worthy of almost a first-round talent, and that power is going to sustain, and everyone thought I was crazy. And guess what? It did. We have to stop getting rid of this notion of, they have to all look a certain way to be a fantasy franchise player. It took so many years for Jose Altuve to get his due, and finally he's gotten it. But the game has changed. If you gave me Jose Ramirez's stats and Manny Machado's body, I guarantee you everybody would be throwing elbows trying to get Manny Machado. But you know what? Those stats are coming from Jose Ramirez, and those are guys that should be low-end first-round picks. But instead, most of the time they're going in the second round. Why? Not because of their stats, not because of the ballpark factor, not because of the supportive lineup. Why are they going later? Because they're not 6 feet tall, and that's ridiculous.
Are there any positions that we do? I know you talked about position scarcity could become a non-factor from what we gauge in the preseason. 2 months into the season, all of a sudden, first base is the deepest position that there is. So we talked about sort of correlating stats and where the value is there. Is there any position in particular you think that is potentially being overdrafted or underdrafted?
Well, that's a difficult one. I think right now what I've seen trend-wise in the early going is I do see that speed trend. It's not so much the position so much as the tool. I think people are going a little crazy for the Trey Turners of the world, or even the D. Gordons of the world to a certain extent. And I just warned about that, because it's one thing to take those guys and it's another thing to overdraft those guys. And if you want to pass on elite level proven players, 5 category guys for that one potential tool, I just think it's dangerous. I mean, what if Trey Turner hitting 2 this year only steals 30 bags? Now, I know that's still a lot, but a 15 and 30 player is nice. A 15 and 30 player, I don't think necessarily is a guy that I want to take top 5 overall. I can find a 15-30 player later on. It's, hell, Bradley Zimmer might become a 15-30 player. Granted, he's not going to hit 280, but still, if you're just looking for the raw stats, they're out there potentially. So it's understanding that how you can pivot from those stats that you need. And I do believe that going with those 5 category guys that do a little of everything is the way to go. I think responsible benchmark building for categories is the way to go. And I don't think punting categories is ever the right thing, because what happens is you just take the good work that they do and it just kind of drags down the rest of the roster along with it.
Are there any tiers that seem like traps to you in a way? Because I look at, and this always seems to surface itself in the second tier of pitcher, where the 4 big guys are off the board, and now you're down to that Strasburg area. You mentioned Syndergaard, who you like, and you think that he's still being underdrafted potentially on where he's going. But then you also have like Luis Cervino, Jacob deGrom. All these guys are going at the beginning of the 3rd round, late 2nd round, that sort of area. Is it better to pass on those types of players and just get the pitchers who are either on the next tier down or just the back end of that tier?
No, I actually think this year is a year especially because the back end rotations are bad. That's actually the group I want to target. If you can give me a whole rotation of Jose Quintanas this year, I would say thank you very much, and I'll be a very, very happy camper. And I think that's what you want to do. You actually want to target a bunch of those guys because they're going to be cheaper than the Klubers and Sales, and they're going to be more dependable than the guys after them. You've got a lot of injury questions out there. You've got a lot of guys, like even the Paxtons who have upside, even a Garrett Richards who have upside. There's so many question marks with even guys in the middle this year, where that very strong tier is actually the 1A number 2 group. There's a lot of guys in there, and DeGrom is one of them, Archer is one of them, Quintana is one of them. There's a very definitive line of those kind of starters, even Garrett Cole, where people are down on him because he went to the American League. And it's funny because if you take his stats up to age 26 season and compare them to Max Scherzer's at the same exact time, they are almost identical. And we do the breakdown in the Black Book of it. Now, I'm not saying Garrett Cole's going to become Max Scherzer, but isn't it funny? Max Scherzer went to the American League and became Max Scherzer eventually, didn't he? And it's funny, the pressure came off of him because there were guys ahead of him that took the pressure off of him where he didn't have to be the guy anymore, right? And that player's name was actually Justin Verlander. And it's funny, Justin Verlander, last time I checked, is the ace in Houston now. So Cole's going to a position where he doesn't have to worry about being the number 1. He could just sit back as a 3 or a 4 and just be Garrett Cole and figure out what that is. Yeah, the DH is going to be there, but so is the defense from Houston. So is the run support from Houston. That's a big change from pitching in Pittsburgh. Okay, so you face the DH, big deal. But Cole, Quintana, those are the kind of guys that I would target and target hard, because I think those are the guys who are going to be more cost effective, and you're going to avoid that drop off of taking too many risks with these guys later on. I'm telling you, starting pitching is off of a cliff at a certain point this year.
Where do you think that line ends up going? What round do you think that ends up going in?
Well, it's harder to say round. I think the easier thing you can say is, once you get past that Luke Weaver upside group, the Luis Castillo upside group, where these young guys have a lot of potential that you believe in, I think those young upside, that crop there, after them, it gets really tricky, because then you're taking a risk on a guy like a Danny Duffy bouncing back. You're taking a risk on, as I said, Paxton. You're taking a risk on guys that do have talent, or worse, if you miss those guys, you're kind of on the outside looking in. I mean, if you go team by team, and you look at Detroit, you look at Miami, you look at San Diego, you look at Kansas City, I mean, they go on and on and on. You look at the Mets, for God's sakes, even a bigger market team where they've got a bunch of question marks for the last 3 spots in that rotation. It's not pretty out there. And that's why, to me, I think the smart pivot this year in a lot of roto is to let those guys go and instead invest later in those late inning relievers like the Andrew Millers of the world, like the Robertsons, the Davinskis, the Betances, because those guys cost you next to nothing, and those guys will give you 5 category production at times, and they have upside for saves. So why not find those guys later on and make it up? And in the meantime, starting pitchers will cycle. There will be guys called up from the minor leagues that'll play well. You saw Chase Anderson last year. You saw Jimmy Nelson pitch well at times. You saw Jordan Montgomery. There are a lot of guys off the waiver wire early going. don't think that you have to just fill that rotation in the draft, because the waiver wire in April, May, June will yield some more guys to you.
So if you were picking, let's say, number 6 or number 7, right in the middle of a 12-team roto draft, and you looked at your team after 5 rounds, what do you think you would want that team to look like? Not even necessarily specific players, but like how many hitters, how many positions, how many pitchers? Is there something essential in there that you need to get outside of grabbing a 5x5 guy somewhere?
Well, most of the leagues I play in are 5 active outfielders. So if we're going like into the first 6 rounds of a draft, I would definitely want to have 3 outfielders already. I would like to have 1, potentially 2 pitchers. And then I'd like to have, some sort of stolen base guy, whether it be a Marte type or somebody in that range. It would be good to have somebody that does have that stolen base upside. It doesn't have to be D. Gordon upside, but a nice 20, stolen base guy, 30 stolen base guy. And that might come early in the draft. It might come with one of the outfielders that I draft early on. But for me, it's about understanding, people will sleep on this every year. If you're in a league, even a 12-team mixer, with 5 active outfielders and a utility spot, which is going to be an outfielder. I can tell you, it's going to be an outfielder. You're 70 deep into the outfield pool, almost 75, depending on guys who qualify at other positions that are going to not be playing outfield, but instead playing first base or infield or somewhere else. If you sleep on those guys, you're going to be in a bad spot. We're going to be looking at players who are in platoons, looking at below average talent. But if you can be good in the outfield there, I'm telling you, outfield is the scarce position. And this year, there's another definitive line too. When you get to that middle of outfield, it gets scary real quick.
How do you go about reaching on players? Because inevitably there's going to be someone in every single draft. There's going to be 3 players that you really like, and other people like them too. So you're going to have to spend an extra round or 2 of draft capital to do it. But how much do you spend? How often should you do this? I know using an ADP sheet might be a really smart thing to do, being like, oh, he's normally going at pick 135. I'll take him at pick 107. Is that too much? Like, how do you go about taking sort of these mid-tier shots or even upper mid-tier shots on guys that you like, but you're going to have to reach on by a round or 2?
Well, ADP is a guideline, Pat. ADP is not the end-all be-all. It's a guideline. And it's not going to tell you what's happening in your draft, too, because if you have to go 30 picks ahead to take a player or 2 or 3 rounds ahead to take a player you really like, so be it. It depends on the needs of your roster. And if you know the drop-off of what's available left on the board can't fill those needs, then you take that player and you don't worry. Who cares? ADP is great. And everybody loves ADP, right? For the first 2 months before baseball starts. And then what happens when baseball starts? You throw it out the window. Where you draft a guy doesn't matter. It's not where you drafted, it's who you drafted. It's about drafting the right players and hopefully at the right time. I don't like to reach for guys, but I will say ADP is a useful tool to at least give you a range of where you can consider them. Like I'll give you, for instance, Nick Castellanos is a player I think ADP-wise has lasted way too long in many drafts that I've done. He has dual position eligibility, which is very helpful because when you draft him, you can let the draft come to you and you say, oh, I'm going to stick him at third base and take an outfielder there because I like the outfielder better, or vice versa. The other thing you can do, which I think is very useful, is on your host site, make your own rankings. And I know it's tedious and it sucks, but do it, because what you'll find is a lot of people will go into ESPN or CBS or Yahoo, and they'll draft somewhere off that ADP and somewhere off the rankings on the site. But if you have your own, you'll know exactly how long you can wait for certain players, because most of the time people will stick inside that box and they won't reach for players, and they'll tell you, I can wait another round to get this guy and I really like him, but I know I can because according to the ADP on the site or the rankings on the host site for my draft, they have him 3 rounds later than this. So split the difference and realize that you can utilize that to your favor.
This happens a lot in fantasy football, just like it does in fantasy baseball, and depending on which site that you do use. So let's say you're going into a Yahoo draft. Do some mock drafts on Yahoo to begin with to see. It's kind of irrelevant where the players are going. That's useful information to have, sure. But just getting used to the system, and the thing that I always like to do is find the hidden players, because with injuries cropping up, some guys emerging in spring training, there's going to be guys buried in like the thousands that they don't get adjusted in time for your draft, and you need to know where they are. Just use your queue. Using your queue, I find, is one of the best things that you can do to really get, you want to talk about like reaching, you're not going to have to reach on these guys. I mean, by the system, you're going to have to reach, but if you have someone who's like ranked 1100th and you know that they're like a 15th round pick, you can probably get them like the 20th round because people just simply forget about them.
Oh, absolutely. Injury guys like Alex Reyes are way down on most sites' draft boards. Guys like, Michael Brantley, who I know he's coming off an injury, and it's frightening because he's had a couple injuries. But we all know the talent is there. Michael Conforto, another injured player. All these guys are lasting way too late. And some of the veterans, too, the Ian Kinslers and Zimmermans. And yeah, they're not the sexy pick. Yeah, no one's going to say, oh, nice pick. Yeah, well, wow, that's really cool. Really sexy Ian Kinsler pick. Nobody's going to care. But you know what? That's an everyday player in a good lineup who's going to play every day. That's important. So in terms of understanding that there's veterans who are being undervalued, in terms of understanding that there's players returning from injury being undervalued, and like you said, using that queue is huge. Going in early before that draft and throwing those guys in there in that queue, so you stay aware of them too, and that will help you absolutely later on make better picks and utilize that back of the draft, because that's where you win a league. You don't win it in the first 10 rounds. You win or lose it in terms of putting yourself in a good position in the last 10 rounds.
When we talk about like on base percentage as a category instead of average, someone like Joey Votto, when there's a whole collection of people, you get a significant bump in terms of how you have to adjust your rankings and where you take them. But if you're in an AL only or NL only draft, do you think it's important to target some multi-positional players to allow you to adjust your roster easier if someone gets hurt? Because the player pool is so much smaller that you can give yourself some more outs. If you target someone like Castellanos, who's third base outfield eligible, being like, oh, now I don't need to replace, I lose an outfielder. Oh, there's more third baseman on the waiver wire potentially that I can go find. I can move him to the outfield, slot in someone else at third base. Is that important? Would that raise the draft stock of anyone?
Well, I'll tell you what, it certainly is something that I would consider when you're talking about splitting the difference between two players. If Cody Bellinger's on the board early and it's between him and another outfielder, well, I'll take Bellinger because he qualifies at first base and outfield. That allows me flexibility as the season goes on, but also allows me draft flexibility. It does make players like a Harrison more useful. It makes players that you have that flexibility. I'm not saying you want to reach for it, but I'm saying it is a helpful thing to acquire.
Yeah, I always just remember the example of Emilio Bonifacio was always a sweet mono league only player because you could literally slot him in any single position besides catcher.
Yeah, absolutely. And dual eligibility is greater than multi eligibility. Ian Desmond's another guy everyone was so high on last year going to Colorado, and he was terrible last year in Colorado because of injuries. And I mean, literally in Colorado, the place where everybody hits, the place where you and I would hit 260, 270 at least. And he was dreadful there. And that was coming off of an injury where every time he came off the DL where he was hurt and playing through it, it happened to be in homestand. So if those Colorado numbers flip and become what everybody thought they were, there's another guy that's lasting way too long in drafts that has power, has speed, and has track record, and now he's playing in an incredible home ballpark. So those are the kind of guys with position dual eligibility that I would certainly look for.
So let's close it out with this, some tips and some traps that people get into in terms of snake drafts. And we kind of mentioned use your queue, become familiarized with whatever site and software that you're using can really give yourself a significant advantage over someone just coming in fresh, knowing how to locate the players properly. And not even just specific players, just knowing how to find players quickly could really help you out in a pinch if you're stuck for a pick, or if the three guys that you have lined up go the 3 picks right before you. How can I quickly find a player, know what I'm looking for, look down those rankings and find where the hidden players, like you mentioned, injury-wise, or someone coming off just a hot spring and you want to get that guy, and where the hell is he in the rankings? I can't even find him. No one is paying attention to him. So what are some more tips that people can look at?
Well, I think the biggest mistake people do in snake drafts is they worry too much about filling out their roster as opposed to getting talent on their roster. And it's not to say that it's not important to make sure that you have responsible talent in your second base or your middle infield and all those spots. But it's not necessarily, you don't want to pass on better players just to fill a spot. And it's about understanding how to build strength on your team. You don't want a team that's just okay everywhere. It's better to have a team that's okay in some spots, but great here or great there. If you can do that, you're going to be contending for a championship. And it's something that I talk about in the Black Book because it's something that relative position value, which is, the evaluation tool, actually quantifies and tells you and shows you in a percentage not only where the positive players are, but where the players who are negative in that fantasy league average who fall below that mark. And so often, Pat, people will draft those guys too soon just to simply fill out their roster, but they're negative players, they're negative impact players, so they're not going to be helpful. And they'll pass on guys that are even marginally positive guys in the positive percentile. And if you take those guys, you at least be strong. You don't want to go swimming in the negative end of the pool. Sometimes you're going to have to. It's just, depending on the depth of league you play in. But to pass on positive impact players, and don't be afraid to create a strength. Hey, I've got a really great group of middle infielders. That happens to be my strength. Or, hey, I've got a lot of great stolen bases and batting average guys. I'm going to keep building this way. Don't just try to pick this guy because I need a blank. Because I need a blank is the worst reason to pick somebody until you're at the end and you really need a blank. Because if you don't get a blank, well, then you're going to need a whole lot of blanks and you'll start using lots of curse word blanks.
Well, if we do need to fill out the blanks very on later in the drafts, who are some guys? Like you mentioned Delano DeShields a little bit earlier in terms of stolen base potential at the end of drafts. Even Gerard Dyson, if he doesn't get overdrafted, that if he's lingering around like the 20th round and you do need some steals, maybe you can take someone like that, at least as a backup plan. Is there power guys, speed guys, run guys, home run guys? Like, is there anyone back at the end that are just specialists that you can fill the back end of your roster with?
There are guys like that, but I mean, even a guy like DeShields is somebody that has decent on-base skills. So DeShields is going to, score probably 100 runs if he stays healthy, and he looks to be the everyday guy. So understanding that those guys are out there. So, I would be terrified to draft a specialist like Billy Hamilton because I think there's a real good chance with Jesse Winker in there this year in that rotation with Schaebler and with Adam Duvall that there's a chance that Billy Hamilton could be riding the pine. But those are the kind of guys, too, to take a look at the Jesse Winkers of the world who I think are up and coming, to take a look at the guys like Michael Brantley, who people are down on because of injuries, but at a certain point, they're free players. And I keep talking about this on air all the time about there's free players where you can just have them later in drafts. People are just saying, here, take Ryan Zimmerman, who is still hitting cleanup for the Nationals, for God's sakes. Yeah, I know he's been less than thrilling sometimes. And I know he was unsustainable first half, had to eventually come back down to earth last year, and it did. But you're going to give him to me for free? And he's a 25, 85 player, and you're going to give him to me that late? There's veteran talent out there who are being undervalued. There's talent who are injury-prone or injury-plagued the last couple of years who are available, who are going to cost you next to nothing. And there's some pitchers, too, that I think are flying in that weird middle zone where you're talking about the Julio Teherans of the world who are terrible at home, but he's had bounce-back years before. I see pitchers that are floating out there like Mike Clevenger, who has upside, pitching for a good team, has real strikeout ability. Yeah, he struggles with the walk sometimes, but Mike Clevenger is a guy that I think can pitch 180 innings this year without a problem. And there will be people going ahead of him who you're lucky if you get 150 out of them. And Clevenger's got real potential for wins pitching for Cleveland. So it's those kind of players and understanding that's where the value is. And if you're going to give me a player who's got upside, who's got proven track record, or who's got an opportunity to just be playing every day for free, give me those guys, and you can take all the potential guys you want, and I guarantee you I'll be ahead of you in the standings.
Joe Pisapia, check him out on Twitter at Joe Pisapia. Can you please spell that for everyone who is actually just listening to this and not watching it? So anyway, when it pops up on the screen, they can read it, but if you spell it out for them, maybe they'll follow.
Yeah, it's Joe Pisapia 17 on Twitter. It's Pisapia, and we try to have some fun on Twitter. Twitter is a spot for stupidity in my world, so it's all baseball, all silliness. And you can also hear my wrestling podcast that I do with Tim Heaney from RotoWire. So those are all good things to pay attention to me on Twitter for.
One more time, pimp the Black Book.
You can get the Fantasy Black Book 2018 edition. It's bigger, it's blacker, it's sleek, it's beautiful. You get it for paperback on Amazon. You can get it for Kindle on Amazon. You can get it on iTunes as well. And it's more than a draft guide. It's I'm telling you, it's a season-long companion tool to help you with trades, to help you run the leagues, to help you work the waiver wire. It's really, see where everything else is the same. It's one of the few things that's unique and it will actually help you separate.
I suggest you buy it, even with Jake Seeley's, affiliation with it.
Despite his work, you should buy it, yes.
Exactly. Spore, Sammy Reed, Jake Seeley, and yourself, all contributors to the Black Book. I suggest everyone do go check it out. I'm Pat Mayo. You can follow me at ThePME on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Plus, you can subscribe to the Pat Mayo Experience video version on the DraftKings YouTube page, Spotify, iTunes, Stitcher, Podomatic, Audio Boom, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, all places you can download the Pat Mayo Experience audio podcast. Rate, review, like, do whatever you gotta do. Just fucking download it, all right? Thanks. I'm Pat Mayo. Enjoy the fantasy baseball season. I'll see you next time.